Hey, I'm Pete. Nice to meet you guys. How's it going? All right, I already asked you that. That's great. So today I'm going to talk about layered UIs with React. Before I get started, you probably want to know like why it's even worth listening to me. First of all, that's my Twitter account. You can send trolls my way. Probably here because I had worked on React while I was in engineer at Facebook. All right, so I worked on React while I was at Facebook. Gave a bunch of talks, wrote a bunch of code that they all just threw out like a couple weeks ago. So this is all going to be super relevant. Since leaving Facebook, I started a company called Smyte. We do trust and safety as a service. So what's a layered UI? Well, a layered UI is when you have some sort of user interface and you put a stackable thing on top of it. So for example, you have this little friends list on the right-hand side, and then when you mouse over somebody, this little hover card pops up that shows a little bit of information about your friend on Facebook. And so that little hover card thing is in something called a layer. Now you see these all over the web, specifically more on the desktop web than the mobile web, but they're all over like enterprise applications, like Smyte, like a bunch of other ones, and Facebook too, even a bunch of consumer apps. You can see another type of hover card here. You can see layers in type ahead, so you focus into a text area. There's a pop-up menu thing. As you type, it auto-completes. That sits in a layer because it's over the rest of the page. There are modals that pop up over the whole page, and they can show a video. This is like a really weird screen cap of a video on the Uber page. And you can build like kind of really interesting custom layers too. So on Facebook, for example, you've got this bottom chat bar, and you could open up one or multiple chat windows, and they will appear over the screen. And what's cool is that if you were to mouse over and show a tooltip in one of these, it would overlap both of them, so that it maintains a stacking order. Does this make sense? We all follow? All right, cool. Tooltips, probably the simplest, most easy one. These aren't just on Facebook too, they're everywhere. So if you ever use Slack, there are multi-level pop-up menus that overlay the application. If you ever use Salesforce, I use it all the time because now I'm a corporate drone, not a programmer anymore. But you get these type of heads in Salesforce, you get these menus in Salesforce, you get these modals in Salesforce. If you're like a real pro with Salesforce, when you add a new account, you'll like type something and then tab to the next field and be like a super pro and keep tabbing through. You want that focus to stay in the modal. So you don't want it to like kind of tab into the data table that's laid under there. And in our product as well, when we were building out our product's definitely like an enterprise thing. We have this dashboard where you can see all the user activity that's going on, and there's all sorts of detail that we need to kind of show to the user, but we can't fit it all on the screen. So there's all sorts of hover cards like this one. There's pop-up menus to filter things like this one. There are other types of hover cards like this one, and there are pop-over kind of like search boxes. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's all sorts of different uses for layered UIs all over the internet. Is everybody on board with this, or does anybody disagree and want to challenge this? All right, cool. That's 11 screenshots, by the way. So what is hard about this? I bet everybody who writes a lot of JavaScript has built one of these at some point. And you either understand already why this is really hard, or you think you're really good at this and this talk is boring. So one thing that's hard is z-index. Everybody familiar with what z-index is? Everybody like kind of know about z-index wars, where you're trying to get a feature out, you just set z-index 10,000, and then the next engineer comes around and sets z-index 100,000. That's a big pain in the ass. And it also doesn't compose very well because you're hard coding what the z-index is going to be. And so if you pop up the menus in the wrong order, you might get a messed up UI. So that really sucks. Visibility management is another thing that sucks. So some of these pop-up menus and pop-up windows and search boxes, how do you close them? Who decides who closes it? Does the menu itself decide to close itself? Or does the thing that popped up the menu decide to close itself? And what happens if the menu wants to close itself, but the thing that popped it up disagrees, and they get in a fight? Who wins? How do you reconcile that? Big pain in the ass. Focus management. This is that Salesforce modal problem. So you're tabbing through all the fields in a form, And you should wrap around, that focus should wrap around back to the top of the form. It shouldn't go all the way down through every single form field or every single link in your page. It should stay within that modal. So that sucks. Global hotkeys. So you might have multiple layers open at a given time. Maybe you have a modal, and maybe inside that modal is a hover card. Maybe inside that hover card is a tooltip. That has happened before. And when you press escape, which one receives that escape? Does it close the underlying modal? Does it close the tooltip? Does it close the hover card? How do you reconcile that? Keyboard navigation. So if you are, if you can't see very well or for other reasons, you have to use the keyboard to navigate the web app. There's all sorts of stuff around, capturing and restoring focus. That's really important to make an app usable. And even if you can use a mouse just fine, power users love to use the keyboard to navigate really quickly. And I think that one of the reasons why the web often feels like crap is because people don't implement this stuff. And so a lot of power users don't get a lot of the features that they would get in the native version of the application. Positioning is another one. So we saw all those tooltips, all those hover cards. You got to position something relative to another element on the page. How do you do that? What happens when they scroll? What happens when multiple are popping up? How do you deal with that? Hover management. See, this is a really long list. I didn't even include everything. Hover management. So when you mouse into something and another hover card, let's say you have a hover card, right? So you mouse over something and the hover card pops up with some details. And then you mouse over something else in there and there's a hover card that pops up within the hover card. And then you mouse over that hover card, but you've left the previous hover card. Should that previous hover card close or not? So you have to manage multiple stacked layers and their hover states, which is also really, really hard. And there's a lot more that I didn't even cover. So again, this is a big problem. If you care about like the 80% solution, maybe you don't invest a lot in this. But if you really want to take it to 100%, either because you're a consumer-facing app and you compete on user experience, or because you've got a lot of power users using your enterprise application, they really want to use all this stuff, you should really pay attention to it. So there's this abstraction called layers, and it's a composable way to solve these problems. So this talk is about, number one, raising awareness of all these problems, and number two, the architecture of applications and how you can solve these problems at scale. So layers were an abstraction kind of originally developed at Facebook, and then we kind of re-implemented it when I left Facebook. It didn't have that code base anymore. But it's really two abstractions. One of them is called a layer, and the other one is called a behavior. The Facebook implementation of layers, which has been around since I joined in 2011, is implemented in like vanilla JavaScript. So it's pure DOM manipulation, event emitters, has nothing to do with any JavaScript framework. The Smyte implementation, which we open sourced about an hour ago, is for React only. And I can talk, yeah, if you look at the repo, it's not impressive. It has a big like unsupported thing on there, and there's a bunch of caveats, but it actually is production code for the last like 2 years. So it does work. Yeah. Good luck. Don't send me an email. All right. So what's a layer? Again, if you've built these user interfaces before, this is probably not a surprise to you. If you've ever used something like React modals or ever played around with the idea of a portal in React, you've probably stumbled across this. And this is, not just a React thing. This is every framework's got something like this. So a layer is a DOM node appended to the body normally. The idea of a layer is that you can stack layers on top of each other. And when a layer is the top layer, you can interact with it. If there's a top layer, if there's a layer above another layer, you can't interact with the layer below it. The top layer visually appears above all other layers. So basically the last layer to open is the most visible one, and it occludes the ones behind it. And each layer is owned by the previous layer in the stack. So if you want to open, so there's always one layer opening another layer and telling that layer when to close. So the conceptual API here is basically, if you've got a layer, you can push another layer on top of it. If you think of a kind of a stack of different layers in your UI. So you can push one on top, and then that could push another one on top, for a long time. And then if you wanted to hide one of those layers, you can pop it off. And then finally, and this is really important, layers know when they're the top layer, because layers should basically turn themselves off and not respond to the user when they're not the top layer. Is this making sense so far? Am I speaking at 1,000,000 miles an hour? Oh, all right, cool, thumbs up, that's awesome. So that's what kind of the conceptual API looks like, and it's kind of sort of what the Facebook API looked like. We built a thing called React Layers. We don't actually have the name on NPM, so if you install it, it's probably a virus or something. In React Layers, you have a layer component, you put some stuff in the layer component, and then it will append itself to the body and render it in the right place. And when you unmount this component or you unrender it, it will remove itself. So we'll call that kind of pop layer function for you. There might be better ways to do this. We can chat about that at Q&A or afterwards if you are interested in helping out and contributing, but this is how it works today. So on its own, this kind of abstraction of appending a DOM node with some kind of visual UI and then popping it off in kind of a stack order solves those two problems of z-index and visibility management. So you never use z-index. You just append the layers, and then they will take care of ensuring that the latest layer is occluding all the other layers. And visibility management, because we said when we create a layer, its visibility is controlled by the layer that created it. So we have a very clear sense of ownership and who decides when it appears and when it disappears. I know that talking about like ownership and deciding whether or not to set a Boolean might sound kind of boring, but when you're building a big app with all these things interacting, having a clear source of truth for who makes the decision is actually really important. And it's often not super clear when you're building these where that should go. So like a good example is you have a modal, right? You click outside of the modal and you want the modal to close, or you click an X inside of the modal and you want the modal to close. Rather than the modal closing itself, it communicates to its parent layer and it says, hey, I would like to close, please. And then the parent layer either honors the request or doesn't honor the request. If you've ever built forms in React, this should be pretty familiar. It's like a controlled input. If you haven't, hopefully I did a decent job of explaining it. So this abstraction, like I mentioned, isn't new. People have been doing it for a long time. And it's actually kind of an official part of React version 16. There's a thing called Create Portal, which kind of assists you in rendering to that kind of DOM node appended to the body within the kind of React lifecycle. So we solved the first two problems, but we got a bunch of other ones, including focus management, dealing with hotkeys, keyboard navigation, relative positioning, and hover management. And so we solved this set of problems with a thing called a behavior. And so what's a behavior? So a behavior is a thing associated with a layer. So you can instantiate a behavior and you attach it to a layer. It belongs to exactly one layer. The behavior, because it's attached to exactly one layer, it knows whether it's in the top layer or not. And based on that information, as well as a bunch of events that might be coming in, click events, key presses, all those sorts of things, it may or may not change how the layer is rendered. So it might change the position of elements within the layer, or it might just call stop propagation on an event. It can do any of those things. So here's a couple of example behaviors for focus management and keyboard navigation. We got two really important ones. The first one is called contain focus behavior. And this ensures that you can't tab to any element outside of the top layer. So what this does is you wrap a portion of your application or your whole layer in this thing called contain focus behavior. And then it detects when you are tabbing to an element outside of that layer, and then it sets the focus to the first focusable element in there. There's another one called restore focus behavior. So if you remember, we're opening up all these different layers. So we might, let's say you're using the keyboard to navigate an app. You would tab through a bunch of hyperlinks. You would press the enter key, and then a modal would pop up, or a hovercard or a menu or something. When we close that modal or hovercard or menu or whatever it is, we want the focus to go back to that link that originally opened it. This is something that like every person that uses a keyboard accessible UI expects. And it's a huge, huge hassle when your app doesn't do this for those people. And so restore focus behavior, basically, when the layer is created, it remembers the DOM element that had focus. And then when the layer is closed, it restores focus to that DOM element. So the thing that you should be getting from this is that these are all really, really simple components that do like one thing. and they're 10 or 20 lines of code basically. There's another behavior called a hotkey behavior. So this is the thing that handles, you press the escape key, what does it do when you have 3 or 4 different things open in your application? So this is basically a top level event listener, and it responds to a hotkey, and it basically doesn't dispatch the event if the layer is not currently the top layer. Pretty simple, right? This making sense? Okay. There's another behavior called Tether Layer. So there's a library called Tether, which is unfortunately now unmaintained, but it works pretty well. And what Tether Layer does is you give it a DOM node and some positioning information that it passes to this library called Tether, and it will position your layer relative to the window and another DOM element in your application. So if you have a tooltip that you want stuck to some link or avatar, this library will make sure that as you scroll, as you resize the page, as new elements flow in, this thing will stay stuck to that DOM element. And on the hover management side and kind of mouse management side, a lot of times we don't want mouse events to affect layers below. So if you have a modal open and you click outside of the modal, we want to close that modal, right? But we don't want to trigger the button or the link or whatever it is underneath that click. We want to actually kill that click, close the modal, and then move on with our lives. And so capture mouse behavior and outside behavior deal with those. Basically, capture mouse behavior just overlays a big invisible DOM element over everything and then just ignores all the click events that happen. And that's the same thing that outside behavior does. There's some other really cool ones as well. There's a behavior called no scroll behavior. So what that basically does is hides the browser scroll bar or disables scrolling while the layer is visible. So again, thinking about a modal, you don't want to be able to scroll down on the page behind the modal. You want it to feel like a focused window. And a lot of modals screw this up that you just see on the internet. You can kind of like scroll the scroll wheel and the background will scroll, but the modal won't. Unique behavior, I didn't write it. I don't really know what it does. Something around mutual exclusion. And layer stack behavior basically gives you an event whenever your layer appears or disappears. So if you have become the top layer, you might want to get notified, or if you are no longer the top layer, you might want to get notified. So how do you kind of put all this stuff together and make this usable? So the idea here is that if you're at kind of a larger company, and Facebook did this, and I know a lot of other companies do this, you have a central kind of UI engineering team that really understands user experience. Maybe they work with the design team, they know the design language, and they build these reusable components that the product engineering teams then take off the shelf and build kind of the business-facing apps. And so what we want to do is we want to basically say, hey, not everybody needs to know about these behaviors and layers. They just need to take a couple of layers off the shelf and reuse those everywhere. And so the way that we do that is we build kind of custom layers. So remember I talked about that kind of generic layer thing that just appends the DOM node and renders into that DOM node that appends the body. We build custom ones for specific use cases. So let's start with a tooltip layer. So the properties of a tooltip, basically it appears on top of everything else and it stays attached to some particular element. So I'm going to walk you through how to do this with React layers. If you build your own layer implementation, it'll be somewhat similar. But the first thing to know is that in React layers, behaviors are just components. If you think about what a behavior has to do, it basically just has to handle events, know about the lifecycle of a layer, and check if it's the top layer or not. And with React, we have all these great lifecycle hooks that give us that capability. We can render additional things, and we can kind of change which children we render based on whatever we want. So they actually map really nicely onto React components. The one thing that we need to do is to be able to know whether we're the top layer or not. And so you have this magic thing called this.context.layer.isTop, which tells you whether or not your layer is top. And so if you know React, this will be useful. If you don't know React, then this is going to be like, I'm going to have to explain JSX, and it's going to get gross, and I don't want to do that. So if we wanted, this is actually like taken from the code base. So if we wanted to render a tooltip layer, we would just compose two components like this. We would say, all right, we want a layer. We want a thing that's appended to the body and rendered. And so remember, that takes care of the visibility and the Z order. And then we want this tether behavior, which is going to take whatever children we pass to it and like stick them relative to the item that we passed in. So we've composed these two things together, and we instantly get a tooltip. Now, what makes this better than every other tooltip library out there, I think, besides thinking through all those different accessibility concerns and all that, is that there's no styling involved, and you've got full control over every step of this process. This is a really low-level primitive, and you can build crazy tooltips that nobody's ever thought of before. So let's build a modal layer. This is going to be a little bit more complex. So here are the properties of a modal layer. It appears on top of everything else. It removes the browser scroll bar. So again, you don't want to be able to scroll the page while the modal is open. We might want to render a backdrop. So the rest of the page gets dimmed, and then my modal pop-up window kind of pops over that. We want to be able to click outside of the modal to close it. Maybe we want to click an X button inside of the modal to close it too. We want to be able to press the escape key to close it. And we also don't want to click on or focus anything outside of the window. So as you're tabbing through, again, focus gets returned back to the first form element. And also focus gets placed on the first focusable thing when the modal opens to make life a little bit easier for keyboard users. We compose a lot more behaviors together. So but what's cool about this, I know that this is like a crazy pyramid, but it actually does a lot of things, and it's pretty cool. So we start with a layer. It takes care of that stacking for us. Then we add this no scroll behavior, which just removes the scroll bar from the browser. Then we give this contain focus behavior, which handles kind of containing the focus in the modal. Then we add restore focus, which makes sure that when we close the modal or when this behavior unmounts, it knows where to return the focus to. Then we have a hotkey behavior where we say, okay, I want to listen to the escape key, and it will only trigger that on key up event if it's the top layer. So if this modal has a tooltip or a hovercard or something, it will ignore that escape key until that layer is closed. We render an optional backdrop, and then we have this thing called outside behavior. So if we get a click event and it's outside of this current layer, we want to close. And we call on request close, which basically signals to our parent, hey, the previous layer, hey, I would like to close. And then the previous layer can decide whether to close this or not. Is this making sense? People like use React here, by the way? Okay, I figured. Yay, MIT license. All right. So Hovercard Layer is pretty hardcore. It's positioned like a tooltip, so it gets stuck to elements in your view. You can close it with escape, or you can click outside to close it. And then it's got this kind of really, from a usability perspective, awesome feature, but it's really kind of a hassle to implement, where if the mouse leaves it for half a second, it will close. So this is not just on mouse leave, close the modal. You have to mouse out, wait half a second, and then it will close. And if you mouse out and then mouse back in, it stays open the whole time. Everyone familiar with this kind of behavior? Anybody use a menu or hovercard that didn't have that 500 millisecond pause? Like really frustrating. All right. So the code's formatted not awesome, but let's walk through it. So we create a layer. We want to be notified when we become the top layer, so we have this layer stack behavior. We want to get notified when the user presses the escape key. We have a hotkey behavior. We want to stick our layer relative to another node, so we have a tether behavior. And then when the user clicks, we want to know so we can close immediately. And when the user moves their mouse outside of this layer, we want to know, because then we're going to start that 500 millisecond timer and then eventually close the modal. Or sorry, close the hovercard. And we also have another div on the inside, so we can know when we move the mouse inside the modal, or inside the hovercard, so we can know to keep this hovercard open. So again, like this is a totally new type of UI. It's very, very different from how you would build a regular modal, but it's implemented with a lot of the same different behaviors. So if we wanted to implement that kind of 500 millisecond delay, we really care about handle mouse move in. So the user moved the mouse while they were inside this hover card, and handle mouse move out. So the user moved the mouse outside of this hover card. And all we do is we record, when the last time we saw the mouse inside was, when the last time we saw the mouse outside was, and then if we last saw the mouse if the mouse is currently outside the hover card, and the last time we saw it was greater than 500 milliseconds ago, then we just request to close it. And so this is an example of a layer that's not just stacking together different behaviors, but you can actually implement a bunch of custom logic, which is really cool. And you might be able to actually implement something like this in a behavior itself, but when we tried to do it, it got a little gnarly, so we just put this in the layer itself rather than its own kind of custom behavior. Finally, we have this kind of handle is top. So remember, we had that behavior that notified us when our layer becomes top. And I seem to remember us wanting the behavior that if the hover card had another hover card in it, and then you click outside of both of them, we wanted to close both of them. So these are all sorts of things that would come from your designer or UX testing, and you're just like, damn it, that's a pain in the ass to build. But you can actually build these when you have a kind of composable abstractions around this. And so we basically looked at kind of, when we become the top layer, are we currently processing a click event? And if we are, check if it's inside me or not, and then close it. So there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with these types of behaviors. So I've told you a bunch of stuff around layers and behavior, and I invented a bunch of fake terminology and stuff. How do I know this is the right abstraction? Well, you got to embrace the appeal to authority logical fallacy. It's a great one. Facebook is built this way. They're valued at approximately $1 zillion. They get a bunch of accessibility awards. So it's probably not wrong. There might be better ways to do it, but this is the way at least one big company is doing it. And we were able to take it from a big consumer-facing company like Facebook, bring it to a small enterprise-facing startup like Smyte, and work pretty well. So where's the code? We have been using this in production for about 2 years. We ship it to hundreds of people, and but it's actually worked mostly unchanged for about 2 years, and we have to do a lot of kind of crazy enterprisey type of things like multi-level type of heads and things like that. So it works pretty well. We open sourced it, like I said, an hour ago. So that's about it. Again, I'm Pete, and happy to take any questions or chat afterwards. I'll be around for a while. Thank you.